Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the Director of Praxis. Today we are welcoming back one of Praxis's favorite guests, Norman Solomon. He is an American journalist, media critic, activist, and former U.S. congressional candidate. He is a longtime associate of Media Watch Group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and in 1997 he founded the Institute for Public Accuracy, which provides outside mainstream news sources for journalists, very much needed today. His books include War Made Easy, The Wizards of Media Oz, Behind the Curtain of Mainstream News, False Hope, and War Made Invisible. He has appeared on many TV shows, including PBS, MSNBC, C-SPAN, Democracy Now!, and a documentary film was made from his book, War Made Easy, with Sean Penn narrating. So welcome, Norman. Today, I know you're going to start with a short presentation because this is a teach-in, and then I will engage a few questions, and after that, we will open it up to everyone on the call to participate, ask a question, or make a comment. So at this point, I will turn it over to you, Norman.
Hey, thanks a lot, Georgia, and appreciation, as always, to Praxis Peace Institute and everybody participating today. It's no secret that this is a stressful time, whether we look at domestic politics or what's happening with war and peace, especially a lot of war overseas. I thought I would talk for a little while about the environment that we're in, especially the media environment, which is so important and so powerful. We have gotten, I think, quite a window into how the media and political dominant systems operate when many lives are very obviously at stake. It's been well over 5 months since the killing began on a large scale in Israel and Palestine, the terrible atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th, and the ongoing atrocities being committed by the Israeli government in Gaza. And I think it's a disturbing reality if we consider the role not of the fascistic Republicans, and Trump has recently indicated he would support, quote, getting the job finished, something like that, in Gaza. Jared Kushner talking about how resorts could be built in Gaza, very lucrative ones. But to look as well and to focus on those in power in the executive branch, the people that I supported, progressives generally supported against Trump in 2020, President Biden. And I think it helps us to understand what some of the basic underlying precepts are that are operative, often with a mask on, and the mask has fallen for almost 6 months now, where the president and the administration and the vast majority of Congress, including the vast majority of Democrats, were just fine with the systematic killing of children and women and other civilians in Gaza. These are people who have been telling us how they are so opposed to the illegal and immoral war in Ukraine. Certainly, an illegal and immoral war is going on in Ukraine because of this horrible invasion and war on Ukraine by Russia. When we lift the hood, so to speak, though, about US policy, both in terms of Palestine and I think largely in terms of Ukraine, we see that the media script and the constant messaging coming from the mass media in the United States, and with a lot of important variations on domestic politics, but less so in terms of foreign policy, running a spectrum from, say, Fox News to MSNBC, the New York Times to the Washington Times, we see this assumption, which is imparted to us, that the US government is basically, with all its flaws, conducting foreign policy based on some kind of basic moral precepts. The moral stature, to whatever extent it existed in people's perceptions of the Biden administration, that moral stature has, for anybody paying attention, totally collapsed in the last 5 months. And what we've seen in the last several weeks is gauging the large, more than 100,000 uncommitted votes in Michigan, seeing the polls, especially among young Americans, that the political gauge at the top of the Democratic Party has begun to be alarmed about the slaughter in Gaza. Not alarmed during the first month or the second month or third month. As a matter of fact, there were frequent statements put out of the White House into January, February, that there was no problem what the Israelis were doing in Gaza. What we've seen is that the administration is saying it was okay, the slaughter going on, but now let's not keep killing quite as many people in Gaza. And I think that's a fair assessment about what has happened. And so we see that this liberal or centrist liberal administration has been just fine with not only accepting, but enabling and arming the mass murder of civilians. 80% of the weapons coming into Israel are from the United States. We know that the administration has bypassed Congress, not just the twice that we have learned about initially this winter, but the Washington Post reporting 100 other shipments kept completely secret of weapons from the United States to Israel. And so when I've looked up at the UN, the definition of genocide, it's a close fit. It fits quite well with what the US is enabling and arming and literally making possible in Gaza. This is a foreign policy and an administration that we're told stands for, in its own words, a rules-based order. It's a very popular phrase. Let's even set aside the fact that Antony Blinken was the chief of staff for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee when Joe Biden held the gavel, and they held hearings to green light and smooth the way to the invasion of Iraq, hearings in the middle of 2002. And Biden, of course, very enthusiastically supporting that invasion. Even to leave that history aside, but in the present time, the idea that it's okay, but the extent of the killing should be titrated. This is the foreign policy of the United States government that is, meanwhile, talking about a rules-based order. And while there has been some critique in the mass media, on the whole, the underlying operating principles, if we can call them that, of the US government have been basically affirmed and supported and accepted by the dominant media in this country. And so if the motivations are not what they claim to be, which I think is pretty apparent in terms of policy towards Israel and Palestinians, then I think that provides us somewhat of a clue as to what the underlying approaches are of the US government in terms of the Ukraine war. As I've said, we should condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, the hypocrisy of the US government is quite relevant in getting a clue to help us then look at the actual historical record of how this Ukraine war came to be and what's happened since it began. Just because there's hypocrisy in Washington doesn't justify what Russia has been doing. At the same time, what Russia has been doing doesn't justify the hypocrisy and the actual policies of the US government vis-a-vis its own outlook and foreign policies on the world. The US government has set the stage for and contributed to this slaughter in Ukraine. President Biden was asked at a news conference several weeks before the Russian invasion, Mr. President, do you support Ukraine joining NATO? And the answer was to foreshadow the end of the possibility of genuine diplomacy. Biden said, well, if Ukraine wants to join NATO, that's fine with us. That was a line that, in retrospect, and even at the time, was very fateful. Can you imagine if the Warsaw Pact or another Russian military alliance reached out to Mexico or Canada, and there was interest in Mexico or Canada to join this Russian military alliance? Can you imagine what the response would have been out of Washington? But the US news media virtually ignore that sort of a reality because the underlying precept in US mass media and politics is the rules-based order means we make the rules and we break the rules. We make it up as we go along because really might makes right. And the US has shown that for decade after decade, invading one country after another, making up its own rules and twisting them around as was convenient. So here we are with a historical record that after the invasion, I mean, as Jeffrey Sachs wrote in the Financial Times before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was virtually no diplomacy involved in terms of the US role in heading that off. But once the invasion began, there's well-documented evidence that Boris Johnson, representing the British government, and US diplomats put the kibosh on what appeared to be a real possibility for not only a ceasefire, but a settlement to end this horrible war in Ukraine. The US wasn't interested. The British government not interested. As a matter of fact, there's been tremendous glee in Washington about the continuation of the war in Ukraine. Senator Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, has said that this is a very positive development for weakening the Russian government, weakening the Russian military. Lloyd Austin has said something from the Pentagon to that effect. This is really good. It's weakening the Russian military. And Senator Blumenthal said that for the United States, it's a great deal because we don't lose any of our own troops at all. And it's a good investment to keep shipping these weapons. Well, certainly it's a good investment. It's also extremely lucrative for the military-industrial complex. As Andrew Coburn has documented in his book that came out a couple of years ago, NATO has been just a huge cash cow for the military-industrial complex as the pledge made to then the Soviet Union that the fall of the Berlin Wall would be accompanied by a promise not to expand NATO, which, as we all know, was flagrantly violated, bringing in a dozen countries, including up to the Baltics, on the Russian border. And so this has been a triumph for the military-industrial complex. During the Vietnam War, there was the saying from the anti-war movement, a sardonic one, war is good business, invest your son. Well, now as war is good business, invest in Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop Grumman. It's more and more aerospace. It's more and more shipping of these very sophisticated weapons. using the term sophisticated advisedly. Let me pause after just making one more point about Ukraine. And anybody who feels the U.S. is involved in a moral enterprise there, I think it's something to think about. And I write about this in my book, War Made Invisible, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it became clear that they were using cluster munitions. And the White House immediately said that that very well might be a war crime. And the New York Times and other outlets immediately documented how terrible cluster munitions are, and certainly very accurately described as one of the most horrific weapons used in modern warfare. The US used 1.8 to 2 million what they call cluster munition bomblets during the first 3 weeks of invading Iraq 20 plus years ago. So at any rate, the condemnation was quite appropriate when Russia was using cluster munitions during the invasion, especially of Ukraine. And then, as you probably recall, as the months went by and going into the second year or so of the war in Ukraine, alarm began become very conspicuous that Ukraine and the United States were running short on armaments, on weapons, on ammunition. But the United States had a huge backlog and inventory of cluster munitions. And so the Biden administration announced that the US government would begin shipping cluster munitions to the Ukrainian military, which they have done in huge quantities. And I just saw they're going to send another big batch of cluster munitions. As you may know, shredding shrapnel that moves sideways, it's known to shred the bodies of civilians over a wide radius. So these are just some examples of how we're in an Alice in Wonderland Orwellian zone here, where the double talk is extreme, where the opportunism is constant, and where the US media are largely, with some exceptions, in sync with an Orwellian process that tells us that not only so much that war is peace, but that seeking war and feeding war is seeking peace, whether in Gaza or whether in Ukraine. This is the warfare state we live in. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. called the madness of militarism. And it's really a challenge for us to recognize as thoroughly and deeply as we can the moral, economic, and political corruption that is at the core of what Dr. King called the madness of militarism. That's the country that we live in. So with that, I'm again want to say I'm very happy that we can be gathering here today with the miracle of internet technology, and I appreciate any questions and comments.
I want to do a few comments and questions before we open it up. And one thing I want to mention is that Norman's book, War Made Invisible, is really important information. And I think everyone on this call or who hears the video later should pick up a copy of it. And also I want to mention another book, The Lost Peace by Richard Sakwa, who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, because in it, he mentioned something that dovetails to what Norman was just talking about. Something I had never heard of before, and probably none of you on this call has, that there was actually a committee to expand NATO that existed. And the head of that committee was the CEO of Lockheed. So this gives you an example of the how enmeshed they are. You know, the government policy, the arms industry, working hand in glove. And this has been going on for a long time. It began in the 1990s. So that's something else to just put aside and to realize it's part of the story here. But one thing I'd like you to talk a little bit about, Norman, before we open it up to Q&A, is how we deal with the simplistic story that's being foisted on us at every turn. And it's the mainstream media, but then it's the people who believe the mainstream media. And usually if it's progressives, it's MSNBC and they believe it. So what we're dealing with are the sound bites that come out of that story. And I wanted to know if you have any ideas of how to approach that simplistic way that the war in Ukraine especially is being promoted to Americans.
I think it's really valuable to keep track of the mainstream media, to watch MSNBC and read the New York Times or the Washington Post, and also day by day watch and listen to Democracy Now, look at Common Dreams, contrast and compare. If we're only in one media environment, then that tends to feel like the circumference of what is reasonable discourse. And to break the silences, and as I talk about in War Made Invisible, the essence of propaganda is repetition and omission. And so what's missing is often the most important propaganda matrix of all. And as we look at all that, I think our own capacities to analyze are really enhanced. So we don't allow one particular media bubble to come at us.
Yeah, I think MSNBC is one of those things that a lot of people I know watch and tend to believe. And I think you're bringing up Democracy Now and Common Dreams. Common Dreams is excellent. I think, you know, everybody should be looking at that. It's really great news and analysis. So that's an online news source, and Democracy Now, of course, too. So what I'd like to do now is open this up for questions or comments from people on the call. If you want to put your hand up, if you have something you would like to bring up. I'm looking for hands. You know, I've got some banner on the top of my computer that makes it difficult for me to see hands up. I don't see them. I'll keep asking questions. And I know people want to ask things, but in the meantime, maybe we could talk a little bit about pressuring our elected officials too, because we had about 28 or 30 people who signed a letter to our congressman here in Sonoma, which is Mike Thompson, but we also sent it to Huffman in Marin, because he's also part of Sonoma County. And we got a form letter back from Mike Thompson of why we support Israel. This was when there'd only been 5,000 casualties, and now there's 32,000. And we got a form letter back of saying why the US supports Israel. No mention of or any answer to any of the things we brought up in the letter. So that's something I think we need to really push and lean on our representatives, because I know they're worried about the election in November.
Yeah, that you mentioned that is really triggers a memory. I was talking last week with somebody who was an assistant attorney general during the Reagan administration. And he said that in 1982, 3, 4, there was one priority inside the administration, inside the Justice Department, inside the various departments under the cabinet heads. And that was to get Reagan reelected. And that's a lot of the calculus, and that's a lot of what plays out in terms of the Democratic Party discipline inside of Congress. And we have the equivalent now of what during the Vietnam War we called the Cold War liberals, who stood for the economic and social programs of the Great Society. And they also were supporting the war on Vietnam as it escalated. And we have something very similar going on now, where we have a lot of people who are on the left side of debates around healthcare, education, housing, the environment, climate, and they're military hawks. And since Biden has become a full-throated military hawk, they don't want to cross him. And they're worried about the Republicans winning, which we all, I think, ought to be worried in this November. And so it's become a very destructive, amoral environment which is reminiscent to me of 1968. And the underlying assumption is that some people are expendable. Some people's lives really matter, some people's don't. Vietnamese people's lives didn't matter at all in the political calculus. Really, Palestinian people's lives don't matter in the political calculus other than bad PR. How do we explain that it was okay in 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months to have all these civilians in Palestine slaughtered, and now there's a modicum of concern being expressed? So it's a political dilemma. And just the last thing I'd say on that point is we're just way too nice to our elected officials. You know, the cliche is true. They're supposed to work for us. And instead of expressing gratitude continually and only for the good things that they do by our lights, we ought to be challenging them when they're part of these horrific policies that are slaughtering people in our names with our tax dollars.
I feel like they're just going along to get along. They don't want to make any waves. And when you mentioned 1968, that's exactly what I've been thinking for quite some time now, where the Democrats lost because they were the hawks. I mean, so were the Republicans, but the Democrats expected more, and young people either voted third party, which I did, or they didn't vote. And I think we're looking at a very similar scenario today. So Mike, I'm going to go to you. You've got your hand up. You want to unmute, Mike?
Thanks. Yeah. So just kind of quickly, briefly, I sitting here listening to Norman, and I've heard him several times. I can't possibly think of one thing that he said that I would disagree with. I mean, I just can't even think of one. And but the thing is that really kills me is that, as everybody says, this has been going on for so long. What he's saying, this is nothing new. I mean, I don't know how far back you want to go. It's before 1990, that's for sure. You just said 1968 and before. So what is common people, what is a common man supposed to do? You say we can't, oh God, we can't have the Republicans come in. Well, I'm beginning to wonder if they'd be any worse at this point, although I've never voted that way in my life. But I just wanted to say that. What are we supposed to do to change that? How can you overcome these incredibly powerful forces that just seems insurmountable? And I just wanted to add one thing, and that is, if you really want to get sick, I'm sorry to bring it up, but I read something in the New Yorker. It's called the New Yorker Daily, and it was about the over 1,000 little children, little tiny innocent children in Gaza who've lost limbs. Okay, they've lost limbs. It shows pictures, how they're trying to get along. They've bombed the factories that make prosthetics. God knows what else they've done. Okay, so the article was just one of the most horrendous things I've read outside of what's normally happening on a daily basis. Little children with no legs trying to, or missing one leg, trying to live a life, wondering where their parents and families are. So it's beyond. I mean, it's like hell on earth. And what I don't know why that happens. And what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah,
You're just sitting here in our comfortable place over here in California.
yeah, the horrors are ongoing. And I read in Haaretz, the Israeli Daily, an article that matter of factly referred to some of the members of the Israeli war cabinet as fascists. That's an Israeli paper. You're reminding me of when I made my trip to Afghanistan. I went to a refugee camp on the outskirts of Kabul, met a 7-year-old girl who had lived in Helmand province, and her neighborhood was bombed by the US military. She lost an arm. And if she's still alive, she's in her 20s now. What really struck me, among other aspects, was that those folks didn't have food. So the US had money to bomb them, but didn't even go to the outskirts of Kabul to give food to those refugees in the camps who'd been bombed out of Helmand province. So that is just a clue to the priorities that you're alluding to that have been reoccurring. I don't mean these these people are Satan, I mean that they have a hierarchy of priorities. In terms of what we can do, I think sometimes of what Noam Chomsky has said, we could spend all of our lives trying to make the world better and push back against such horrific events, and we might not have an effect. But if we don't do anything, it's for damn sure we won't have any effect. So it's that possibility that not only individually, but most importantly, that individuals working in tandem with each other, that the aggregate of us can really make a difference. There are various ideological approaches. I don't know of a better one than whoism from the Dr. Seuss book, Horton Hears a Who, where sometimes that one last voice gets the aggregate voices over the top. And a lot of it's about organizing. The mass media don't encourage organizing. Let's face it, we're encouraged to go out and buy things and every once in a while go out and vote. I love what Tim Carpenter, who led Progressive Democrats of America, used to say, and we really miss Tim, he's passed away. He said, the spreadsheets never make it into the history books, but sometimes what we do with the spreadsheets can make history. And that's a possibility if we organize.
Yeah, Carpenter was a wonderful person who I met when we were both delegates for Jerry Brown for president years ago, 1992. So I see that Linda has her hand up. Do you want to go ahead? You want to unmute?
Yeah,
Linda?
thank you. I had a similar question. But I'll go on to another topic. What is your prognosis? I mean, we've got a election coming up. So that's just about the one thing we can pay attention to that could make a difference. What is your prognosis about how we should support the election? And then where do you see all of this warmongering leading us? I mean, is there anyone like strategizing? I mean, we've got almost the third world coming on. There's lots of talk about that. Is it the military industrial complex that's holding all the cards right now? And we just, if we didn't organize, what do you see as the future of all of this?
Well, my easy answer, which I'm only partly serious about, is that my crystal ball is in the shop. We don't know what's going to come up. The aphorism from Antonio Gramsci keeps applying: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have reasons for pessimism and optimism. The cognitive part says we're up against the wall, it's going to be downhill from here. But the optimism of the will is very important. As Howard Zinn used to say, sometimes when everything looks bleak, there are breakthroughs. The example of ending apartheid in South Africa, which seemed almost perhaps impossible until it happened. And so I fall back continually on the historical reality that when people organize, there's no guarantee, but that is the way that the most ominous possibilities and realities get set aside and defeated. In terms of the election, we have this strange, of course, but real system of the Electoral College. And looking at the presidential race, and I think it's crucial to defeat Trump. And a reality for the left is that if Trump wins, we're going to be back on our heels on the defense for 4 years. If Trump loses, at least we have some space to organize within, which has been the case in the last few years. So in 40 states, I wouldn't waste my breath talking about how people should vote for president, because it just won't matter. Whether it's California, New York, Alabama, it's very clear whether all the electoral votes are going to go for the Democratic or Republican nominee. I do think that in the 10 or so swing states, it really does matter. And this kind of analysis will be important. Often there is scorn heaped on the idea of lesser of two evils. But when we, I think, step back, we see that that exists all the time. I mean, when I go to San Francisco, I could walk, but I don't, because I decide that's more of an evil, if you will, than burning fossil fuels. So constantly we're making these sort of choices. And while understandably we can say to ourselves, it can't get any worse, it can.
Mhm.
It always can get worse. And so I think that's going to be a challenge. A lot of the congressional races, even in the safe states, we have a lot of congressional races that matter. In some cases, we have legislative races and others. So there are a lot of discouraging aspects. I know at RootsAction.org, we have been having a lot of discussions on this, and we uh, hired and had operations. I would just briefly summarize in 3 swing states. We chose Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin. We had full-time people there. We did what we called online canvassing, put a lot of our resources in. That was 2020. In 2024, given the need to titrate the dose of our resources, we're going to concentrate on defending the squad. And AIPAC's going after Summer Lee in Pittsburgh, going after Cori Bush in St. Louis, Jamal Bowman in New York. The Israel Can Do No Wrong lobby is ponying up, they say, $100 million to take out the squad and other progressives. We need those progressives in Congress. And that's one of the things that we can do. Also think that visibility and protests and raising these issues is really important. And I put it in a brief plug at rootsaction.org. We've been sponsoring the Diffuse Nuclear War Project, which is an anti-war effort to organize nationwide to address the threat of nuclear war, which is connected to the war in Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, and elsewhere. And if you're interested, we're going to be doing something we're calling Daniel Ellsberg Week. And this is something that people can participate in anywhere. We've chosen June 10th to 16th for 2 reasons. Dan Ellsberg passed away during that week. And also there was the 1 million person rally for nuclear disarmament in Central Park in New York City on June 12th in 1982. So those are events, there are many events that people can do. If you go to diffusenuclearwar.org, you'll see a lot of sort of a menu of events under the Daniel Ellsberg Week category. Again, that's diffusenuclearwar.org. And the last thing I'll say about that is that one of the things being done for Daniel Ellsberg Week coming up is to go to city councils, to boards of supervisors, to legislators, and say, we want a street named after Daniel Ellsberg. We want Daniel Ellsberg Avenue. We want a public library to be named Ellsberg Library. We want to have a civic presence at a plaza, Daniel Ellsberg Plaza. That's important for a lot of reasons, and I'll give you one example. When Dan Ellsberg's book came out, The Doomsday Machine, about the threat of nuclear war, this was about 7-8 years ago, at rootsaction.org and the Institute for Public Accuracy, we bought 535 copies of the paperback. And Dan wrote individual letters, Dear Congressman Smith, Dear Congressman Thompson, this is why I wrote this book. Right now, we are headed to nuclear war. And we folded that letter on top of the book, and we hand delivered it to each congressional office in DC. And so many of the staff people I met, I would say, the people who greet you at the door when you walk in the door, or maybe they'll say, oh, I'll bring in a legislative aid. Many times I would say, and here's a letter and book to Congressman Jones, Congresswoman Smith from Daniel Ellsberg. And they would say, oh, I'm not familiar with that name. Who's Daniel Ellsberg? And these are people working in the US Congress. And that's an example of why I'm excited about Daniel Ellsberg Week and establishing avenues and schools and libraries named after Daniel Ellsberg.
Now, this is very interesting what we do commemorate and what we don't commemorate. When you mention the possibility of nuclear war, this is not on people's minds so much. They think that's in the past, that we're not really in any danger of that. And probably we're not in any danger of it from the Israeli war, but we are in danger of it with the Ukraine war. And I think most people who are supporting Ukraine in this war are not seeing that possibility. So I'd like you to maybe say a few words on that. And I'm still looking for other questions. If people have questions, please put your hand up.
Yeah, absolutely. When Daniel Ellsberg and I were talking, and I was so lucky to get to work with him about the invasion of Ukraine, he felt that the escalation of military conflict in Ukraine was greatly increasing the chances of nuclear war. And one of the reasons is, and this is a focus of Daniel Ellsberg Week, is the existence of land-based missiles. They're the only ones, the ICBMs are the only nuclear weapons that are on a use them or lose them basis. They're on hair trigger alert. There's no way on either side that the sea-based or the air-based nuclear weapons are on a hair trigger, use them or lose them aspect. There's no reason that a president or of either country can be told, look, you've got to decide whether to fire nuclear weapons at the other side because our sea-based or submarine missiles are under attack or our air-based nuclear missiles are under attack because they're not vulnerable. They can't be brought down by the other side. But the 400 ICBMs that are in silos on hair trigger alert in 5 US states, they can be taken out with a first strike or be perceived to be about to be taken out by a flock of geese, which were often mistaken for a nuclear attack and ratcheted up a readiness for the US to retaliate against a non-existent attack. And so if you go to diffusenuclearwar.org, you'll see we have a lot of information about ICBMs. And as he talks about in his book, Daniel Ellsberg has tried to emphasize that eliminating ICBMs, even unilaterally, would be the single most important step to reduce the chances of nuclear war. And one last point on that, in US media and politics, unilateral has a dirty word. It is a dirty word. And in the case of ICBMs, that's crazy. It's like you're standing in a pool of gasoline and your adversary is standing in a pool of gasoline and you're both lighting matches. If you stop lighting matches, you could be accused of unilateral disarmament. You would actually be engaging in insanity.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this first strike option that some countries have insisted on having, like the US. What other countries have insisted on having a first strike option?
Well, for 12 years, Russia did not assert a first use option, and then they reinstated that it was in their policy. The United States has always had an explicit policy in its national posture review, its nuclear posture review that's issued every few years. And when President Biden, well, aspirationally President Biden, campaigned in 2020, he said that if he were elected, he would get rid of the option of the US being the first to use nuclear weapons. In other words, he said, I will institute a no first use policy of the United States in terms of nuclear weapons. And when he signed off on the nuclear posture review as president, it said, we retain the option to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. So campaigns are one thing, governance is another.
Yeah, it's frightening what could happen. I often go back to using the example of Khrushchev and Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, because that could have been, and probably if it happened today, it might be a nuclear war. It's like they were cooler heads in a very difficult time, and we were very afraid that we were going to be bombed and that we would be in a nuclear war. I mean, I remember those days very clearly, how scary they were. And I feel like if the people who are in power today were in that situation, we might have been in a nuclear war.
Yeah, an example of that is after the Cuban Missile Crisis, about 8 months later, President Kennedy gave a speech at American University. And the wisdom in that speech is in the dumpster at the White House. What JFK said is that we've learned through being on the precipice of nuclear war that we should never put a nuclear adversary in a position where they feel they're in a corner and they have either the option of capitulation or a launching of a nuclear war. And in many ways, as the United States has seen the solution of the Ukraine conflict to be to pour more and more weapons into Ukraine, it's that situation. Again, it's the Canada-Mexico analogy. Ukraine is not Fiji in terms of what Russia's outlook is. It's a huge border with Russia, and the presence of military forces so close to Russia is a red line. And one last thing I'd say on that, it's not just about Putin. Every sector, including the democratic advocates inside Russia, throughout the political degree of positions in Russia, they have all been totally against the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO or the expansion of NATO. So it's not just this now dictator, Putin, who is against expansion of NATO. This has been a real the hell with you, we're going for a regime change attitude from the United States. Regime change in the sense of we will build so much pressure on your country that all bets are off.
Yeah, you know what? I was doing some research on the number of military bases that the US has versus Russia, because I thought, the story here is that Russia is going to try and take over the whole former USSR and then keep moving through Europe. And yet the reality is it's the US that's doing that, not Russia. And just seeing the juxtaposition of the story we get and in many ways believe versus what really is happening. It's just mind-boggling to me, because we have literally pushed Russia into a corner by surrounding it with the NATO. And what I did discover is, of course, the US, and most of us know this, has over 800 military bases around the world. Russia had fewer than 30 when I looked it up, and I think it has even fewer now. So who's really trying to take over the world here?
Well, yeah, a couple points on that. The US spends as much on the military as the next 10 countries combined, and most of those countries are US allies. There are ABM systems the US has installed on the border of Romania and Poland, and as NATO countries, and they can easily be retrofitted to be attack nuclear missiles. And just again, Cuban Missile Crisis was all about, you don't get to do that on our border.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it applies for us, but we don't think it applies elsewhere. So I'm going to see if there's anyone who has a comment or question. This is the time to do it. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Norman to give us a summary of what he thinks we should know before we finish with the program. So first, any questions? I guess there doesn't look like there are. So Norman, what would you like to leave us with today?
This year, it's no secret, as I was mentioning, but I'll reiterate, this is a very stressful time. And the combination of the climate emergency, which is getting very little appropriate response from the federal government, and the escalation of the warfare state, these massive military budgets, and the insecurity that reflects and contributes to, plus the threat of a fascistic president coming in next January, it's understandable that we're, it's like that bumper sticker, if you're not upset, you're not paying attention. So we're upset because we are paying attention. And often people are inclined to feel, understandably, look, this is just too awful. I don't even want to look at the news. It's so depressing. And we can feel that way because it makes sense. And at the same time, for most people I know and I've talked to, when they are more engaged, when they become more active, they become less likely to be depressed and debilitated. Because if we're feeling like we're simply watching a movie, we're passive, we're consuming history like Wonder Bread on the shelf, that's really dispiriting. That just feels it's a very creepy zeitgeist that we, in a sense, create for ourselves if we're passive. So, despite all the obstacles, I really uh, encourage people to think about what, in particular, suits our life situation, our skills, our interests, our passions. Nobody can do anything but a small amount of what's needed, but everybody can do something. And organizing is absolutely essential. We all know about organizations, and hopefully some of them feel very compelling. I'm really excited to be in the 11th year of organizing with RootsAction.org. We started with 0 email list. We now have 1.2 million with a variety of extent of involvement. Some people are rarely, if ever, responsive. Some people are frequently responsive. It's online activism. And so it takes about 30 seconds for people to sign up. You go to rootsaction.org, you put in your email address and your zip code, and you won't be deluged, but you'll be offered possibilities to take action, usually online, but sometimes other ways. And one of the bright spots in general, I think, is that in recent years, after the right wing had a big head start, a lot of progressive energies and organizing have taken hold online. And so we have an embarrassment of riches, so to speak, to take advantage of. And of course, sometimes we wish the emails would stop. Maybe we're on too many email lists, but still in all, I think picking and choosing and focusing is really valuable. It's going to be a difficult year, maybe not as bad as we expect. And if people can organize well enough, we could be pleasantly surprised.
Oh, one last thing I wanted to say, with Roots Action, which I think is very important, that I had failed to mention it earlier, and sorry about that, but it is a very important organization for online organizing. And also wanted to ask you lastly, Norman, if Roots Action has a considerable number of younger voters involved, and because they're going to be pivotal, I think, in this election in November.
We've really been trying to do that outreach, and a number of our staff people now they seem young to me. They're in their 30s, and that seems young. And I'm learning a lot from them. I don't go on TikTok. We just had an email effort. I should briefly explain that we did a drive to try to debunk the AIPAC slander that critics of Israel are anti-Semitic. And so we contacted more than 100 prominent Jewish Americans to sign a statement against AIPAC and against support of the racism and terrible policies of Israel. And we got some wonderful people who signed. If you go to rootsaction.org under news and views, you can look at the details. People like Tony Kushner, Peter Beinart, and many others who have been willing to speak out. The president of the American Postal Workers Union. And the reason I thought of that is that we then did a TikTok message explaining what that open letter was about, to challenge the dominance of AIPAC and pro-Israel forces. And yesterday when I looked, we had 550,000 views of that message. So we were able to reach more than 500,000 people. And that's not because I know how to do it, but it's because somebody in their 30s who is on TikTok on the staff is combining with our other skills to make it happen.
Great, that's what I wanted to hear. So good to have all this, the younger people working on the social media aspects, because they do reach a lot of people. So I want to thank you, Norman, for being with us today and for talking about the difficult things we're up against and how important it is to stay active and be active against not only the wars, but toward our election this year as well. And I want to thank everybody else who's been on the call and those who will watch it later. Who will watch the video later. You will all get a copy of that tonight. And I'm going to stop the recording right now. Thanking you, Norman.
Thanks a lot, everybody.